The Rick and Shane dynamic from The Walking Dead is one of the most compelling and layered television storylines I've ever seen. It's slow burning, tense, and does a perfect job of demonstrating the stakes of the apocalypse. But today, I wanted to pose the question, what if Rick and Shane never fell out? Now, we all know in the show, Shane takes a little bit too much care of Laurie, but in this hypothetical timeline, we're going to explore a world where Shane and Laurie were completely platonic, and these two brothers turned rivals, well, would never become rivals in the first place. So this is what would happen if Rick and Shane never fell out. Now, Season 1 and the early parts of Season 2 would be pretty similar in terms of storyline to the actual show. Rick and Shane might argue about the Fort Benning idea, but Shane most certainly would not then hold up a gun to Rick. And ultimately, I think the group would still end up at the CDC, and going into the early parts of Season 2, I still think Sophia goes missing and our group end up on Herschel's farm. After Carl's shot and Otis and Shane head to the school to get medical supplies, I still think Shane would probably sacrifice Otis in order to save Carl here. And after Carl does make a full recovery, I think this is where we'd start to see the alternate timeline start to separate itself from the main show. First of all, it's after this point Rick finds out about Shane and Laurie's affair in the episode Secrets, and this results in Rick now calling upon members like Daryl and Glenn to accompany him when he goes out rather than his old friend Shane. But in this timeline, there is no secret for Rick to find out. So this rift we see in the main show never really happens. I still think Shane would be incredibly vocal to Rick about calling off the search for Sophia, but the two friends would still be going strong at this point. Now, with Shane being much more stable and not infatuated by Laurie, do him and Andrea actually become a thing? I mean, trauma brings people together, and this disturbing scene in Season 2 could have become a regular occurrence. On top of this, does a stable Shane also still open the barn and kill the walkers? Now, this is really hard to say. Ultimately, I do think he does this in some capacity, just not in the manner in which we see it in the actual show. Shane has his head screwed on and knows keeping those walkers so close to camp is dangerous, so I do think he would have gone against Rick's word here and killed the walkers in the barn in some shape or form. Whether it had been in such a public displaying like it was in the main show, I'm not sure of, but I still think it's done. And as a result, Herschel still would end up at the bar drinking. It's at this very point I think Shane and Rick would be clashing a lot, as Shane basically led the group prior to Rick's arrival, so naturally there would be some butting of heads. Along with this, the way they both viewed the world at this point was so different that disagreements are bound to happen. I mean, Shane as an individual is much more impulsive and opinionated than Rick, so again I think he's still clashing with Herschel and Dale, just like he was in the main show. But back at the bar, Dave and Tony arrive, Rick's forced to kill them, and Randall is brought back. They ultimately, as a group, decide to execute Randall, and although Shane and Rick do go back and forth around the idea, they eventually follow through. Now this is where it gets really interesting. With Randall dead, Shane doesn't lead away Rick to try and kill him, meaning there's no gunshot that draws the massive herd of walkers that eventually invade the farm. Now, we all know the farm was almost an illusion of safety. It provided a short-term sanctuary and a rest from the chaos for our group, but without the horde of walkers destroying the farm like in the show, our group wouldn't know how truly vulnerable they were until it was probably too late. I mean, they were staying in essentially a house with a fence around it. It was bound to fall at some point, whether that was from the dead or from other survivors. Along with this, Laurie might not even be pregnant in this timeline. It's not confirmed who the actual biological father of Judith in the show is, but most people assume it's Shane. And to be fair, the timelines kind of match up. But in this timeline, nothing happens between Shane and Laurie, so she might not even be pregnant. So we will assume at some point our group are driven off the farm and end up at the prison, just like in the show. Now again, if Shane and Andrea are a thing, or even if Andrea is just with our group, we never meet the governor or Michonne. Along with this, Shane and Rick probably agree to kill all the prisoners after Thomas's actions, meaning even Axel and Oscar probably die right here. But again, to spice things up, let's assume we do come across the governor. How would the duo of Rick and Shane handle him? I think the group as a whole, with Shane taking up a joint leadership or even a second in command role, would have been a lot less welcoming to other survivors, meaning I think they would bring in far fewer people than we see in the show. On top of this, in this timeline, Rick wasn't forced to kill his best friend, which was a catalyst for his transformation into the survivor he became, so I'm quite divided on how Rick would have led. Would he have listened to the wisdom of Herschel or the impulse of Shane? And would Rick still be holding on to his ideals from season 2? Now, the governor would pose a threat to our group that they'd never really encountered, and it would all depend on how the two sides would meet. Would the governor and his scouts come across Rick and co at the prison, or would it be the other way round and our group would stumble across Woodbury? Either way, I think they'd realise the threat of Woodbury and the fact that they were severely outnumbered. And with Shane in Rick's ear, the group would probably cook up a plan similar to the one in the show, where they would hide and ambush the attackers. But this time, with the more brutal mindset of kill or be killed by Shane, they would probably take out the governor right here. Meaning Herschel, Laurie and Andrea probably all survive in this timeline, but characters like Michonne and Tara never come across our group. Now, it's really hard to say from this point what would have happened. The prison was secure, well protected, and if our group did succeed in killing the governor and managed to keep the prison functional, they probably would have thrived here for at least a couple of years. Rick and Shane would have been a formidable partnership, and who knows, we could have even got a Shane Jr. in this time, and Rick might have had a child with Laurie that was actually his, other than Carl that is. I could see the two of them working really well around this point in the apocalypse. Shane would have become more stable and would probably listen to Rick and Herschel a lot more, and likewise Rick would have become more hardened, so the two of them would have met in the middle ground, and therefore agreed on a lot more decisions. Again though, for the sake of this video, let's fast forward all the way to Alexandria, as I think the Terminus storyline would have been pretty identical even if Shane was there. Now, right off the bat, I think Aaron's life is in a lot more danger with Shane around. When he first tells our group about Alexandria, understandably they think it's a trap, and with Shane there, it could get very ugly very quickly. I mean, this guy would trust absolutely nobody. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say he didn't kill Aaron and the group successfully make it to Alexandria. Like Rick, Shane would also start to assume control from Diana, and I believe, like we saw in season 2, Shane would combat train the Alexandrians. Heading into the Savior War, he would be all for killing the outpost. In fact, I think he'd probably be the first one to have that idea. Now, at the lineup, it would have been fascinating to see Negan come face to face with Shane. How would he have reacted? I mean, we all know he's a hothead, so would he have done something like Daryl and punched him in the face, or would he have been able to compose himself? Either way, in the aftermath of the lineup, we see Rick almost surrender to Negan's regime. But if Shane did survive the lineup, whilst Rick was moping around, he would probably assume the main leadership role. He would orchestrate some form of attack on the Saviors, but as we know, the Saviors outnumbered and outgunned our group massively. With little weapons and soldiers, Shane most likely would have acted impulsively, kind of like how Carl acted. The only difference is, Shane's not a kid, and Negan would have probably just killed him if he captured him, unlike Carl. Shane's more ruthless nature would have forced a different, more aggressive approach to the war, changing everything. And part of me believes that this is where Shane could possibly die, as this more aggressive and a possibly reckless retaliation towards the Saviors could get him killed in the all-out war storyline. But once again, let's fast forward to the Rick and Negan fight in the season 8 finale. Rick slices his neck open and decides to let Negan live. For one, Shane is most definitely not agreeing with Rick on this one. In fact, I think Carl and eventually Rick's idea of a unified world where communities work together against the dead would not be understood by Shane. And after the bridge incident some years down the line, Shane would assume full leadership of all communities. And he would probably either banish or more likely slaughter the surviving Saviors. And that includes Negan, which would have probably been backed up by Daryl and Maggie in some capacity. So our group would probably look something like this after Rick's disappearance. Shane and Andrea have a child now and lead the group. Laurie and Rick's child would still be alive. Daryl and Shane would be out looking for Rick most days, whilst the Council of Alexandria, in the absence of Michonne, in this timeline would consist of Gabriel, Rosita, Andrea, Laurie, Sadiq, and probably Aaron. And going into the final two storylines of the show, with Shane now leading, those being the Whisperer War and the Commonwealth, we'd again see a very different approach, with Shane now solo leading in Rick's absence. Firstly, the Whisperer War. It would have been totally different. Shane would have either flat out given Lydia straight back to Alpha in exchange for peace, or more likely just massacred the Whisperers as they stood unarmed outside of the hilltop walls. And although Beta and a few others weren't present here, they would be taking out a huge chunk of the Whisperers and also their leader Alpha. This, just in general, would have made the Whisperers far less threatening, and again Shane would have taken the offensive route here, most likely tracking down their camp and ambushing them, aiming to totally eradicate the hostile group and eliminate the threat altogether. And in hindsight, it's probably what needed doing in the show. As for the Commonwealth, his presence would have completely changed how the events played out. The Commonwealth was a structured society with corrupt leadership and a clear class divide. This would have directly clashed with Shane's views. Shane never trusted outsiders, especially those in power. Whilst Rick historically is willing to hear leaders out, such as the Governor and Deanna Monroe, Shane would have been skeptical from day one. He'd see the Commonwealth's rigid class system as a ticking time bomb and would not tolerate the way the rich lived comfortably whilst the lower class just survived. As for Lance Hornsby, Shane would have seen right through him and recognised him as the opportunist he was. And although they probably would have initially worked together as it benefited both parties, he would have turned on him. I can, however, see Mercer and Shane gaining a lot of respect for one another and probably working together, ultimately starting the revolution a lot sooner. However, instead of waiting for the Commonwealth soldiers to join, he probably would have forced their hand a lot earlier. But in turn, this means the Commonwealth leadership would have most likely been overthrown far sooner with Shane in charge. Unlike in the show, as our characters try to reform the Commonwealth, I have no doubt that Shane would probably try and dismantle it altogether. He would have viewed the Commonwealth as a pipe dream from the old world that is no longer realistic in their current reality. So, let's take a look at who's still alive in this alternate timeline, where Rick and Shane never fall out. As mentioned, I think Andrea, Laurie and Herschel would all survive, whilst characters like Negan, Alden, Beta, Alpha and the Governor would have all died far sooner, or in Negan's case just would have died. But ultimately, Rick and Shane would have made, quite frankly, an unstoppable duo. Their balance of morality and pragmatism would have allowed them to thrive in the apocalypse, and in my opinion, they probably would have never left the prison. After defeating the Governor, they would have made it home and slowly regrown a community there. Shane and Rick would have probably had kids, Carl probably never dies, and I think the group thrives in this environment. But for the sake of this video, I wanted to explore the other storylines from the show. But let me know down below what you guys think and if you agree with how I think the storylines would have played out if these two friends never fell out. Once again, this is all just my own speculation and a totally hypothetical timeline. And ultimately, I'm glad Rick and Shane fell out as it gave us one of the best storylines ever written. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching today's video. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed, as we are on the road to 10,000 subscribers. But again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.